On the night of July 14th, 1881, Sheriff Pat Garrett gunned down Billy the Kid. Or did he? Why, after all this time, is there still so much confusion surrounding the alleged death of William H. Bonney? Is it true that Pat Garrett's own deputies said that he killed the wrong man? Why did Sheriff Garrett bury the body without letting anyone get a good look at it? What was he trying to hide? And why the hell was there not a photograph taken? If Garrett really did kill the kid, then why didn't he receive the reward money? And while we're asking questions, just who was this Billy Barlow character? What was that all about? And who was Brushy Bill Roberts? Did Brushy Bill really have all the same scars as Billy the Kid? And wasn't there a photo comparison study conducted by the FBI that showed Brushy and Billy were a 93% match? We're going to discuss all of this and more as we finally clear up a few misconceptions concerning one of the greatest history hoaxes of all time. My name's Danny Shane Gillis McBride, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza! Pat Garrett never received the reward for killing Billy the Kid because he couldn't prove that the kid was dead. No photo, no body, no proof, no reward, right? Well, you may find this hard to believe, but everything you just heard is 100% false. Matter of fact, not only did Garrett receive that bounty on the kid's head, but he received it twice. If you'll recall, back on December 23rd, 1880, Sheriff Garrett arrested Billy the Kid over at Stinking Springs. Skip ahead a few weeks later, and per the January 13th, 1881 edition of the Las Vegas Gazette, Garrett was paid the official $500 reward that Governor Wallace had offered for Billy the Kid, and a lot more to boot. Thanks to grateful citizens, Pat ended up walking away with around $1,500. And then, of course, the kid escaped, and Garrett tracked him down again, killing him on the night of July 14th, 1881. And although the second reward was delayed, Garrett did ultimately collect it. But why did it take so long? Was it because Pat couldn't prove that he killed Billy? Negative. The delay in payment was purely bureaucratic and based on a technicality. Well, actually two technicalities. The wording of the notice, as placed in prominent newspapers by Governor Lew Wallace, read as follows. Billy the Kid, $500 reward. I will pay $500 to any person or persons who will capture William Bonney, alias the Kid, and deliver him to any sheriff of New Mexico. Satisfactory proof of identity will be required. Signed, Lew Wallace, Governor of New Mexico. All right, so as you can see right off the bat, the first issue is that Garrett killed the kid rather than capturing him. This did prove to be just a minor issue, as all seemed to agree that Pat had no other choice. Even the governor of New Mexico, Lionel Sheldon, stated that Garrett could not technically comply with the terms of the reward because when he, quote, met the kid in Maxwell's room, it is very certain that one or the other would be killed. It was not a reward, the payment of which depended on conviction. The kid had been convicted and was under sentence to be hanged. Garrett was in pursuit with an intention to capture, if it could be done normally, but under the circumstances of their meeting, capture was out of the question. End quote. And those are the exact words of Governor Sheldon. Second and biggest issue had to do with whether or not the reward was a personal offer from former Governor Lew Wallace, and if so, was the territory of New Mexico still bound to make good on it? Wallace had placed the notice on December 22nd, 1880. He then resigned as governor less than 5 months later on May 5th, 1881. Before the kid even met his demise, hell, Wallace wasn't even in New Mexico when Billy was killed. On July 21st, 1881, just mere days after the kid's death, the Santa Fe Daily reported that acting Governor Rich, quote, announced that he was willing to pay the amount and would be glad to do so, but that he would have to look at the records first, end quote. And by records, I don't mean proof of the kid's death. Essentially, he just needed to determine whether or not Lew Wallace had made it an official reward on record with the territorial government. Rich consulted with the district attorney, William Breeden, and according to Breeden, the reward was indeed a private offer since Wallace had never bothered to file it on record. Per Breeden, quote, this certainly appears to be the personal offer of Governor Wallace, and it seems he did nothing to indicate that it was intended as an executive act on behalf of the territory. If the reward should be paid, it is very probable that the legislature would approve the payment if so desired, and that no objection would be raised. However, if Governor Rich should now direct the payment of the claim, he would doubtless expose himself to the charge of misappropriating territorial funds, end quote. In other words, the governor just couldn't take money from the territorial coffers as he pleased all willy-nilly like. There had to be a legit reason, and it was up to the legislators to approve this reason, which, according to Rich, they would do during the next legislative assembly. Sure enough, when the legislators met in February of 1882, they unanimously voted for Garrett to receive the reward. They even stated explicitly that the delay was caused by a quote-unquote technicality. This was followed up by them proclaiming that Pat did kill Billy the Kid and that he was entitled to the $500 reward. And just like before, Garrett ended up getting far more than just that $500, thanks to the grateful citizens of New Mexico. All total, he came away with several $1,000s. So yeah, I have no idea where the rumor that Garrett never got the reward comes from, but it is patently and provably false. Be that as it may, this certainly is not the only misconception out there concerning Billy the Kid. Sadly, much of what people think that they know about the kid is often based on misinformation. Rumors are just flat-out made-up stories that get repeated as fact, and before long, these falsehoods are so ingrained into the narrative that they're almost universally believed. Which is mostly why I decided to make this episode, to hopefully clear things up a bit. I know not everybody has time to read the books or to take a real deep dive into the subject matter. I get that. However, I do find myself answering the same questions on a daily basis. And a lot of these questions are stemming from misinformation, the type of misinformation that lends credence to guys like Brushy Bill Roberts. Ah, yes, my old friend Brushy Bill. Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in. Now, it's my opinion that most people who entertain the idea of Brushy Bill Roberts and Billy the Kid being the same person are just simply misinformed. At no fault of their own. They're not stupid or gullible or anything like that. It's just that they hear all the stories about Billy's death, which we'll get to here in a moment, and most of which are untrue, and they start thinking that maybe there was something fishy involved. Maybe there was a big cover-up and Garrett didn't really kill Billy the Kid after all. And then they hear all the stories about Brushy, all the so-called evidence, and things start to add up. I don't blame anyone for buying into it. At face value, it seems very believable, at least until you dig into the evidence. But unfortunately, like I mentioned a moment ago, most people haven't taken the time to really study the material and verify what's true and what's false. Once again, this is nobody's fault. We all can't be experts on everything, right? Unless this is your job or just a hobby that you're extremely passionate about, there's no way you're going to spend countless hours studying a bunch of boring old news articles and primary sources. However, should you actually take a gander at the historical records, those primary sources and first-hand eyewitness accounts, many of which I will be shining a light on today, you'll soon understand that it's really all much ado about nothing. Here's another great example. You'll often hear that one of Pat Garrett's own deputies claimed that Garrett killed the wrong man. Huge if true. I mean, you got to admit that does sound pretty suspect, right? And yeah, truth is, just moments after Pat Garrett allegedly gunned down the kid, Deputy John W. Poe did indeed tell Pat, "You shot the wrong man." Like I said, pretty damning, right? The only problem is this quote has been completely taken out of context by people who, frankly, should know better. The statement in question comes directly from Deputy Poe's book, The Death of Billy the Kid. Quote, "An instant later, Garrett came out, brushing against me as he passed. He stood by me close to the wall at the side of the door and said to me, 'That was the kid that came in there onto me, and I think I have got him.' I said, 'Pat, the kid would not have come to this place. You shot the wrong man.'" End quote. Now, if that was all there was to it, then I'd agree that it would certainly cast a little doubt as to who Garrett killed. That said, all you gotta do is just keep on reading. 2 paragraphs later, Poe writes, quote, "After some forceful persuasion, we induced Maxwell to procure a light. He finally brought an old-fashioned tallow candle from his mother's room at the far end of the building. He placed the candle on the windowsill from the outside. This enabled us to get a view of the inside, where we saw a man lying stretched upon his back, dead, in the middle of the room, with a 6-shooter lying at his right hand and a butcher knife at his left. Upon examining the body, we found it to be that of Billy the Kid." End quote. So obviously, once you take the entire statement in full, it's very clear that Poe was initially describing his emotions at the moment, his disbelief and just the confusion that naturally comes from being mere feet away from a deadly shooting. And then he goes right on to state in no uncertain terms that, yeah, the man Garrett killed was, in all actuality, Billy the Kid. Hell, the title of his book is literally The Death of Billy the Kid. You see what I'm saying, right? Most people aren't exposed to the full text. They just hear or read that one little snippet, and all of a sudden, the idea that Garrett killed the wrong man isn't so hard to believe. Couple that with the false information on Pat not receiving that reward, and things really begin to add up. And from there, it just sort of snowballs. So, what are some other misconceptions? How about the false claims that Garrett and his deputies immediately buried the kid, or whoever they killed, before anyone got a good look at the body? This is also verifiably and patently not true. Billy was killed sometime either late at night on July 14th or shortly after midnight on the morning of the 15th. And it wasn't until later on the next day when he was buried. He lay there on the floor of Maxwell's room as Pat and the deputies forded up inside, worried about some of the outlaw's buddies trying to avenge his death. When the attack never came, Garrett sent for the local justice of the peace, Alejandro Segura, no relation to Tom Segura. And upon arrival, Segura formed a 6-man coroner's jury, which was headed up by local businessman and former politician, Milner Rudolph. After investigating the killing and speaking with the only eyewitness to the actual shooting, Pete Maxwell, the jury then issued a finding which described how Billy was killed and who killed him. Quote, "We, the jury, unanimously find that William Bonney has been killed by a bullet in the left breast, in the region of the heart, the same having been fired from a pistol in the hand of Pat F. Garrett." And by the way, we know they saw the kid's body because Segura noted that the coroner's jury, quote, "proceeded to a room in said house where they found the body of William Bonney, alias the Kid," end quote. And yes, the men of the jury all knew Billy the Kid personally. What's more, they were not the only ones who saw the kid's body. Far from it. Keep in mind that Pete Maxwell did not live alone. His mother, his siblings, and even Delvinia Maxwell all heard the shot and came to investigate. Another resident of Fort Sumner, Paco Anea, also came to see what was causing all the ruckus, and he too would later write about what he saw at the Maxwell home, including naming several other eyewitnesses. Furthermore, according to Paco, it was Delvinia Maxwell who dressed Billy for the funeral. Per another eyewitness, Jesus Silva, quote, "At 10 o'clock we buried Billy the Kid in a little cemetery near the old fort, besides the bodies of Billy's former pals, Charlie Bowdry and Tom O'Folliard. I was the chief pallbearer at Billy's funeral that morning. With me were Antonio Saavedra, Sabal Gutierrez, Vicente Otero, and a few others. We buried the kid in a grave which had been dug by Vicente Otero," end quote. You see how these witnesses are starting to stack up? I did an entire episode on this a while back titled "Was Billy the Kid's Death a Hoax?" Link down below if you'd like to learn more. But long story short, historians have been able to identify over 24 people by name who all agreed that Garrett killed the kid. And these were people who were at Fort Sumner at the time of the killing. Some of these witnesses helped to carry the body out of Maxwell's room. Others prepared him for burial, while still others dug the grave. And that's just the people we know by name. According to the aforementioned Delvinia Maxwell, in an interview she gave years later, damn near everyone who lived at Fort Sumner attended the funeral. I don't have the exact number in front of me, but if I'm not mistaken, there was close to 200 people living at the fort in 1880. So even lowballing it, I think it's safe to say that 100 people minimum were in attendance. It was likely more, though, as Paulita Maxwell would state, that practically every man, woman, and child in town followed the body to the little cemetery. So no, Pat Garrett did not stop anyone from seeing the body, and he didn't bury the kid before anyone could get a good look at him. Hell, Pat didn't bury Billy the Kid at all. That duty fell to the residents of Fort Sumner, many of whom lived for decades after Billy was killed. They were interviewed quite a bit over the years by journalists and historians, and not a single one of them ever hinted at the idea that Garrett killed the wrong man or that Billy escaped. You'll often hear that the coroner's jury report was faked or that it never even existed, and that's not true either. The day of Billy's funeral, Garrett sent a letter to Santa Fe, which included a copy of the report that he got from Alejandro Segura. Both the letter and the report were then published in the July 23, 1881 edition of the Las Cruces Rio Grande Republican. You can read it for yourself if you want to. As for the original coroner's jury report, per proper protocol, this was sent by Mr. Segura to the district attorney of the 1st Judicial District of the Territory of New Mexico. And years later, when the original was compared with the copy that Pat sent to Santa Fe, they matched up perfectly. So as you can see, we don't just have to take Pat Garrett's word for it. If you're looking for a more unbiased account, you can always read the story of Private George Miller. He too was at Fort Sumner when Billy was killed, and he gave his story in the July 18th, 1881 issue of the Las Vegas Daily Optic. And then, of course, there's Milner Rudolph, the head of that coroner's jury. He gave his own personal account of what he witnessed, which was then published in the Las Vegas Daily Gazette. And geez, man, how many damn newspapers did Las Vegas, New Mexico have in 1881? That's the real conspiracy. Now, Milner wasn't just some backwoods country-ass nobody. Like I said earlier, he was a former politician and a highly respected businessman. He was also a Santa Fe ring man, so the idea of him lying to cover up Billy's escape really isn't all that believable. His son Charles gave an account as well. Charles Rudolph did know Billy. He was even part of the posse that arrested him back at Stinking Springs. Charles wrote of what he witnessed there at Fort Sumner in his personal journal, and his journal was later printed. Then there's Jose Silva and his son Jesus. Jesus even helped to remove the body out of Pete's house and would later assist in digging the grave. His daddy Jose served on that coroner's jury. Both men knew Billy the Kid very well, and Jesus' first-hand account would ultimately be published in the July 13th, 1938 edition of the Clovis News-Journal. Indeed, Jesus Silva lived long enough to hear rumors about all the fake Billy the Kid impersonators and was adamant that his friend Billy was among the dead. Another member of the coroner's jury was Sabal Gutierrez. Now, despite being related to Pat by marriage, Sabal had been very close to Billy. Although, I'm not sure how much of this was out of fear or allegiance. One version of the kid's final moments has him relaxing there at the Gutierrez home before Sabal's wife, Celsa, sent him to go fetch some meat for supper. Speaking of Celsa, she's the one that gave Billy that butcher knife that he was allegedly carrying, a knife that Deputy John W. Poe would later return to her. Celsa's son, Candido, would sign an affidavit years later swearing that he saw Billy take the butcher knife from his mother minutes before the killing. Ursula Baca was just 9 years old at the time, but she too would sign an affidavit years later stating that she attended Billy's funeral. Genio Garcia was another witness, and he also assisted in dressing the kid when the women were done cleaning the body. And let's not forget about Mike Cosgrove, superintendent of the U.S. Mail, who was there at Fort Sumner on business. His brother actually lived there, and Mike gave his account in person a few days later in Las Vegas, an account that can be found in the archives of the Las Vegas Daily Gazette. Now, I'm not going to sit here and name everybody who was an eyewitness, but I think you're starting to get the picture, right? I'll drop a link down below to an article from the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition, which names even more people, as well as a report compiled by historian Dr. Robert Stahl that goes really in depth as far as the eyewitnesses are concerned. I just want to be as clear as possible that this is not just us taking Pat Garrett's word for it, okay? Or even just relying on his book, The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid. At least one of these people I just mentioned kept a journal. Others were interviewed by authors and journalists and historians. Some wrote letters, and hell, some of them even wrote books of their own, detailing what they saw. You may not care too much for Pat Garrett. You may think that he was a liar or just an all-around bad person. But like it or not, his claim about killing Billy the Kid is corroborated by many eyewitnesses. And out of all of them, not a single person who was there at Fort Sumner would ever come forth and claim that the entire thing was a hoax or that Billy the Kid somehow escaped. I'll say it again, not a single person who was at Fort Sumner in 1881 ever denied that Garrett killed the kid. It's also worth mentioning that in the years following, when Pat Garrett was running for office or when he was vying for a presidential appointment, he received a ton of opposition. The press smeared Garrett as a drunk and an atheist and even dragged his wife's name through the mud. But in the midst of all that, Pat's most avowed enemies never tried to claim that he didn't kill the kid. Okay, fine, smarty pants. Why didn't they take a photograph then? What was Pat trying to hide? Look, I know we've been conditioned to believe that snapping photos of dead outlaws was a common occurrence because we've all seen the old photos. Jesse James, the Daltons, Ned Christie, Rube Burrow, Bloody Bill Anderson, who else? John Wesley Hardin. Be that as it may, when you stop and think about it, how many of these pictures actually exist? What, like maybe 15 or 20? I mean, really, how many photographs of dead Old West outlaws can you think of right now off the top of your head? There were thousands of criminals roaming the Wild West, many of whom we don't have photos of while they were alive, much less dead. Yes, some dead outlaws were propped up and photographed. The vast majority, however, were not. And that is just an undisputable fact. So number one, the idea that it was a common occurrence is simply not true. It did occur, but it just wasn't all that common. In most cases, these outlaws were simply buried in shallow graves, end of story. As far as the logistics are concerned, there was not a photographer living at Fort Sumner at the time of the kid's death, at least not according to the 1880 census. The one and only photo that we have of Billy, the famous tintype where he's standing with his rifle, that was taken at Fort Sumner sometime in 1880, but it was taken by a traveling photographer, whose name, unfortunately, we do not know. For Garrett to have gone and fetched someone with a camera, it would have been like a 5-day round trip minimum. By that time, he could have simply hauled the kid's bloated and decomposing carcass through the summer heat all the way to the Capitol himself. But what would have been the purpose? Oftentimes, people tell me that Pat needed a photo to provide proof that he killed Billy, but we've already established that is not the case. He had proof in the coroner's jury report, alongside the many eyewitnesses who lived at Fort Sumner who saw Billy's dead body before burial. And we know for a fact that this was considered sufficient proof by the authorities because A, they literally gave Garrett the reward, and B, you can read them discussing Billy's death in their own words, via correspondence and official records, and not a single one of them, whether it be the governor or the acting governor or the district attorney or even Thomas Catrone, the head of the Santa Fe ring, not a one of them ever questioned the fact that Garrett killed Billy the Kid. And besides, let's not forget, everybody knew the body was buried there at Fort Sumner. If there was any real doubt, they could have just headed down there and dug him up. So no, a photograph was absolutely not necessary, and it wouldn't have accomplished a damn thing anyway, then or now. Hell, you just heard me say that there are photos of a dead Jesse James, but that has not stopped conspiracy theorists from claiming that Jesse lived to be an old man. If someone is a hardcore conspiracist, then there is no amount of proof or evidence, be it a photograph or even DNA, that will convince them otherwise. And that's fine because this episode is not for them. I know there's nothing I can do that will change their minds. Jesus himself could appear and tell them that Brushy Bill Roberts was a fraud, and they still wouldn't believe. What you're listening to now is for the majority of people who remain open-minded, those with a healthy respect for the historical evidence and accuracy, who have simply been provided false information. Okay, moving forward. There is an interesting story about the kid's appearance at the time of his death. You may have heard this already, but there were reports that Billy's skin was stained dark, almost as if he was trying to pass himself off as Hispanic. Also, he had allegedly grown a beard, or was just in the process of growing one. This is often pointed out as proof that Pat Garrett killed the wrong man, an assertion backed up by Brushy Bill Roberts himself, who claimed that a Mexican named Billy Barlow was who Garrett actually gunned down and buried there at Fort Sumner. But where does this rumor originate from? Looks like the earliest this report can be found is in the July 19th edition of the Las Vegas Daily Gazette, so just 3 days following the kid's death. Quote, "Since his escape, he, Billy, had allowed his beard to grow and attempted to disguise himself as a Mexican by darkening his skin by the use of some sort of a root." End quote. The Colorado Springs Weekly Gazette ran with a similar story a few days later on July 23rd, and they too wrote that the kid had been, quote, "recently going about disguised as a Mexican," end quote. It was also on the 23rd that the Las Cruces Rio Grande Republican ran with a long story on the kid's death that in part read, quote, "he was allowing his hair and beard to grow and was putting his skin through a coloring process, which he fondly hoped would so completely Mexicanize him as to give him a thorough disguise," end quote. So yeah, there you go. At least 3 papers within days of the shooting claiming that Billy was attempting to disguise himself as one of the local Hispanic residents. And like I said, this was further backed up by Brushy Bill Roberts decades later, who claimed that the person that Pat Garrett killed was a Mexican or part Mexican known as Billy Barlow. My personal opinion is that this is blown way out of proportion. Not only do we not know who provided this info to the Las Vegas Daily Gazette, but whoever they were got a lot of stuff wrong. For instance, in the same article, the Gazette stated that Billy was a 24-year-old who had killed his first man over an insult to his mother and that he had a sister residing in Santa Fe, none of which is true. and that paper out of Colorado Springs erroneously reported that Billy's last name was McCarthy as opposed to McCarty. These are small errors, sure, but just goes to show that not every single word in every single news article can be taken as gospel. You gotta compare and contrast, right? You take information like this, and you see how it stacks up against other things that are proven facts. Also, worth noting that none of the eyewitnesses there at Fort Sumner ever said anything about Billy's skin or him trying to grow a beard. And by the way, I'm not even trying to say that it's not true. Billy may have been attempting to disguise himself, as fugitives are known to do. All I'm saying is that it's not the bombshell that many Brushy Bill proponents seem to think it is. As far as the mysterious Billy Barlow, this comes from one source and one source alone: Brushy Bill Roberts. As is the case with the beard and the skin, not a single resident of Fort Sumner would ever mention anyone by the name of Billy Barlow, much less hint at the idea that Garrett killed a Hispanic man and tried to pass his body off as the kid. There is zero evidence that Billy Barlow ever existed outside of Brushy Bill Roberts' own imagination. Another misconception is that Pat Garrett would have never killed Billy the Kid on account of their friendship. I mean, think about it. Why would Garrett turn on his own best friend? Maybe he had a change of heart at the last second and let Billy escape. First of all, yeah, Pat and Billy were friends. This relationship is often downplayed by historians and even armchair wannabe historians like myself. But the fact of the matter is, the evidence does point towards Pat and Billy being pretty good friends. That said, let me quickly smash yet another misconception by pointing out that Garrett never rode with the kid. As much as I love Young Guns too, they got that part wrong, at least as far as the evidence we now have at our disposal is concerned. Pat Garrett was not one of Billy's outlaw pals, or criminal co-conspirators, or anything like that. They were simply gambling buddies whenever the kid was at Fort Sumner. That said, I'm not really sure why this would stop Garrett from killing Billy. What I'm about to say is purely anecdotal, but I personally know someone who was killed by their own best friend. Guy I went to school with from kindergarten all the way up to graduating high school. They had been out drinking, got into an argument over a girl, and his buddy shot him dead. Like I said, anecdotal, but this is something that happens. Friends do have arguments, sometimes pretty serious arguments. As far as Pat and Billy, their relationship seems to have ended whenever Garrett decided to run for sheriff. According to Paulita Maxwell, this decision came as such a shock of surprise. In Paulita's opinion, what Pat did by accepting that job was an act of betrayal and something that was against the unwritten code of the frontier. A man should not turn against his friends. So while Pat and Billy were pals, at one point, whatever fond feelings they had for one another had been greatly diminished by 1881. And finally, a misconception that I hear far too often is that Billy was too smart to have fallen prey to the likes of Pat Garrett. Once again, this is provably false. And we know this is false because Pat Garrett did indeed catch Billy on other occasions prior to July 14th. Back in December of 1880, literally 4 days after Lew Wallace placed that bounty on the kid's head, Pat Garrett and a posse arrived at Fort Sumner and set up an ambush. Later that night, here comes the kid and his gang riding boldly up to the fort, seemingly without a care in the world. And moments later, Tom O'Folliard was on the ground dying of a gunshot wound as Billy and the others hauled ass in the opposite direction. Like all Garrett had to do was show up at the place that Billy was known to frequent and just wait. And it worked. He may not have gotten his intended target on that particular occasion, but he certainly proved how easy it was to get within shooting distance of Billy the Kid. And this scenario was damn near repeated the following day. Garrett sent a spy to tell Billy that the posse had departed, leaving Pat and just one deputy alone there at Fort Sumner. The kid was ready to ride back in, guns a-blazing, and take care of business, but Charlie Bowdry talked him out of it. Then, of course, just a couple of days after that, Garrett took the initiative and tracked the kid down to a little stone building at Stinking Springs. And after a short siege, he was successful in arresting Billy the Kid. So the idea that Garrett didn't have what it takes or that Billy was too smart just doesn't add up. Not to say that Billy was not smart. I happen to think that he was a very clever young man. You can read the letters that he wrote and quickly determine that he weren't no imbecile. All I'm saying is that he's not the tactical mastermind that many make him out to be. And Pat Garrett certainly wasn't so incompetent that he couldn't apprehend him. In the months that followed that arrest there at Stinking Springs, the kid would be found guilty of murdering Sheriff Brady and sentenced to hang. But he did manage to escape captivity. And then what did he do? He returned right back to Fort Sumner. He didn't go on the lam in old Mexico. He didn't skid on out of the territory. No, he went right back to where everybody and their mother knew that he could be found. Fort Sumner. Once again, all Pat Garrett had to do was show up with a small posse and wait. All right. So hopefully this helps to clear up a few misconceptions surrounding the death of Billy the Kid. The main points I really want to hammer home is that there were many eyewitnesses there at Fort Sumner on the night of Billy's death, and that Garrett did not deny anyone the right to view the body. Also, not a single person who was there at Fort Sumner, including Pat Garrett and his deputies, ever so much as even alluded to the idea of Billy getting away. There's also no record of anyone in authority, the governor or the district attorney or any members of the Santa Fe Ring, questioning Billy's death. Yes, Pat Garrett did receive the reward. No, a photograph was not necessary, and Garrett had previously proven that he was capable of catching Billy Bonney. For the killing to still be a hoax, this would entail that A, Pat changed his mind at the last moment and allowed Billy to escape, or B, he killed the wrong man and buried the body before anyone outside of Fort Sumner could find out. For either scenario to be true, this would entail that literally everyone at Fort Sumner, hundreds of people, would have had to have gone along with the hoax for the rest of their lives. But why would they? Perhaps out of fear of Pat Garrett? Maybe. But several of these eyewitnesses would live for decades after Pat's death. Surely at least one of them would have come forward after that. And don't call me Shirley. Or maybe they went along with it to protect Billy. This would assume that everyone there at Fort Sumner loved the kid and were looking out for his best interests. We know this is not true, as some of these people had been actively working with Garrett and supplying him with information on Billy's whereabouts, like the rancher Manuel Brazil. Beaver Smith is also suspected of aiding Pat, as was Pete Maxwell. And then there's Milner Rudolph, who, as I already mentioned, was a Santa Fe Ring sympathizer. Also, let's not forget about people like Private Miller, who were just passing through. Miller had absolutely no loyalty to Billy the Kid one way or the other, and yet he shared his own personal stories with the paper and, just like everybody else, confirmed that Garrett killed the kid. I'm positive that many, if not most, of the people there at Fort Sumner liked Billy the Kid as a person. We know that he was a very popular guy with the locals, especially the senoritas, but not everybody liked him, and that's a fact, and all it takes is for one individual to have come forward for the entire hoax to fall apart. Furthermore, the theory that the kid disappeared hinges on him never again resurfacing. Garrett would have been placing his career, his future, and the future of his family in the hands of a young criminal. That would have made Pat literally the most gullible person on planet Earth. Look, I get that most people don't like Pat Garrett, and far be it from me to attempt to defend his honor. Truth is, most people I know, myself included, have serious issues with Garrett's official account of how he killed Billy. There are unanswered questions, and some of the eyewitnesses would give conflicting testimony in the decades to come. The one constant, the one thing that never changed, the one point I'm really trying to highlight here, is that everyone, literally everyone, who was at Fort Sumner in 1881 was in agreement that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. Now, one final word on Billy the Kid misinformation. There are thousands of anecdotal stories floating around that are impossible to corroborate, and they're usually along the lines of, my great-grandma was best friends with Pete Maxwell's hairdresser, and she said that Pete told her that Pat Garrett shot the wrong man. While such stories are always interesting, I'm sorry, but that's just simply not how history works. I don't know about you, but I'll take the word of the many eyewitnesses who were actually there at Fort Sumner over some vague stories that have been passed down through the generations and told by people who were not there. So yeah, while the anecdotal stories are fun, they are not to be relied on as historical proof of anything, as there is simply no way to corroborate them, and especially considering that the actual primary sources directly contradict the anecdotal. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's go ahead and address some of the common misconceptions in regards to Mr. Brushy Bill Roberts. Once again, when you take his story at face value, it sounds very compelling. 90-year-old man riddled with numerous scars from ancient battles, has inside knowledge about the life of Billy the Kid that nobody else could have possibly known, and people who actually knew the kid vouched for Brushy and said that they were one and the same. Holy shit, say no more. I almost convinced myself just now. Only thing is, once again, if you dig just a little deeper, you'll learn that none of that is true. But first, I think it's important to dispel the myth that Brushy Bill was just some old man minding his own business when all of a sudden that lawyer, William Morrison, showed up knocking on his door and asking questions. Truth is, Brushy had been making outrageous claims for quite some time prior to Morrison ever getting involved. According to Roberts' family lore, as early as 1918, Brushy was trying to pass himself off as the infamous Frank James. 1918. Just 3 years after Frank's death, and Brushy's already trying to capitalize on it. Allegedly. Now, I did just say that was according to Roberts' family lore, and I know that's not very reliable. One could even call it hearsay, or anecdotal. I was just bitching a moment ago about anecdotal stories, and here I am, sharing a damn anecdotal story. Shame on me. Thankfully, we do not need to rely on the anecdotal. The following article was published in July 22nd, 1936 in the Grand Saline Sun. Brushy Bill Roberts, whose experience as a cowpuncher, ranger, and frontiersman have stored his mind with a varied assortment of stories of bygone days, had one hair-raising anecdote of more recent origin to relate yesterday. It was in 1932 that outlaws caught me in a trap near Gladewater, Brushy opined, as he stood straight as an arrow in front of his listener. Brushy Bill is not tall, nor is he a superhuman as far as bulging muscles are concerned. But his carriage is something to be patterned after, and he is no slouch when it comes to wearing clothes that breathe of the western plains. I was in the river bottom near a spring when 4 men, each carrying a machine gun, appeared from thin air, and covering me with the weapons they suggested that I beat a hasty retreat, continued Mr. Roberts. I was more than glad to do as they suggested, but I had only gone a few yards when I met some rangers who were looking for the outlaws. When they asked me if I had seen any suspicious characters, I told them to get back in their car and drive on, Mr. Roberts related. Although the rangers wanted to argue with me, I finally convinced them that we should all leave. And when we finally got out of the trap and I had a chance to fully explain the situation, they thanked me profusely for saving their lives. End quote and end of article. So there you go. 13 years before Brushy Bill ever met with the governor of New Mexico, he was already telling tall tales. And let's not forget about his association with fellow fraudster J. Frank Dalton. Their relationship also predates Morrison's involvement. You can find them posing together in a photo all the way back in 1942. And by the way, shout out to a guy on YouTube whose last name I cannot pronounce. Michael Anthony Jadishishi? I don't know. Sorry for butchering that, but shout out to Michael Anthony G for that little tidbit from the Grand Saline. I don't know Michael, we've never spoken, but I saw that he posted a short video about this a few months ago, and I went to check it out for myself, and sure enough, it is legit. Link down below both to Michael's video and the article in question, which is available online if you too would like to cast eyes on it. So yeah, long story short, Brushy was telling lies prior to 1950. The idea of him saving Texas Rangers from machine gun toting gangsters is laughable at best. Okay. So with that out of the way, you may be asking yourself, what about those scars? After all, according to William Morrison, author of Alias Billy the Kid, he asked Brushy Bill Roberts to show him some evidence, at which point Brushy Bill dropped trowel and showed Morrison that brushy bush. It was then discovered that the drapes did indeed match the curtains. No, sorry, just being silly. But yeah, per William Morrison, in the book Alias Billy the Kid, Brushy Bill did strip down, and Morrison claimed to have counted 26 separate knife and bullet scars. 26! That's a lot of fucking times to get shot and stabbed, and still live to be 90 years old. Now, I hate to break it to you, but other than the words of Mr. Morrison, there is no evidence that any of these scars existed. You know, you want to talk about taking photos, why wouldn't Morrison have documented some of these scars? There are a ton of pictures of Brushy Bill Roberts, and 0 of them include the alleged scars. And just an FYI, just to clear things up, Billy the Kid was only shot once, in the leg in 1878. Well, at least until his final rendezvous with Pat Garrett. So all of these other scars, even if they did exist, are inconsequential. The only one that would matter is if Brushy had a scar on his leg in the same place that Billy the Kid had one. And once again, there is no evidence that this is the case. And no, there's not an autopsy report that backs up this story about the scars. Sorry, but that's just not true. If you've got evidence that says otherwise, actual real evidence, other than anecdotal hearsay, please don't hesitate to contact me, josh@wildwestextra.com. Now, based on the documented evidence, we know that Brushy spent much of his entire life working on farms. And working on a farm is not easy. I know plenty of old men who also spent their entire lives working on farms, and they do have a variety of really cool looking scars, none of which came from bullets. It's a hard job and injuries do occur, especially back in the old days. So even if Brushy did have a multitude of scars, it wouldn't necessarily mean that he received them in combat. Now, just as an aside, just a personal funny story, but I knew a guy years ago, back in my party days, who was lying to these girls that I was close to and claiming to have been a member of Delta Force. Yeah, that Delta Force. I don't know what the whole story was. I think he was trying to move in with these girls and find a place to stay rent-free. Anyway, I told him that the guy was full of shit, and one of the girls sort of got angry with me and told me that he had shown her his scars. Skip ahead a few months, and the same girl gives me a call and tells me about how the truth finally came out, that she had talked to the guy's mother and that he was just a cook in the army for like a year, and any scars that he may or may not have, he most likely got from playing football back in high school. These fraudsters like this guy, and even like Brushy Bill Roberts, will not hesitate in showing you a bruise or some old scar they got building a birdhouse and claim that it came from a bullet. Just because they say it happened does not mean it's true. Okay, so moving on, did Brushy Bill Roberts have inside knowledge or know things about Billy the Kid in the Lincoln County War that nobody else could have possibly known? Negative, he did not. Truth be told, Brushy, or possibly even William Morrison, stole much of the story straight from Walter Noble Burns' 1926 book, The Saga of Billy the Kid. This was an extremely popular book back in the day. It was either the first Book of the Month Club or one of the first Book of the Month Club books, if I'm not mistaken, and was even circulated periodically in newspapers. Now, my friends over at the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition have a great article about this that I'll link to below, but long story short, whether it's the black soldiers that were involved during the Battle of Lincoln, the Cedillo girl story that Brushy liked to tell, the story of him hiding a pistol in a tree, all of this stuff either came directly from the saga of Billy the Kid or other similar books or newspaper articles. You gotta remember, Brushy didn't meet with Governor Mabry until 1950. Billy the Kid had been dead for nearly 7 decades. There had been numerous books and even movies made about Billy the Kid's life. So no, Brushy had no special insider knowledge. He was just repeating shit that he heard or read somewhere else. Even the stuff that we now know was wrong, like the idea that Billy the Kid was left-handed. The only reason that people thought that the kid was a southpaw is due to the famous tintype being a reverse mirror image. As crazy as it sounds, it wasn't until around 1954 when observant historians finally realized this and corrected the photo. If you look at the original, not only is Billy's pistol on his left hip, but his belt buckle is backwards and the receiver is on the wrong side of his Winchester. When you flip the image around, all is well, and the kid is clearly carrying that self-cocker of his on the right side. Of course, Brushy Bill didn't know all of this, so he swore up and down that he was left-handed. Now, just a minute ago, I brought up the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition. I really want to give these guys a shout-out because they've proven to be an absolute wealth of information. It was Josh Slatton, who I believe is the executive director, who was kind enough to provide me with the source info on Garrett receiving that initial reward after arresting Billy at Stinking Springs. And that is not the only thing that he and his colleagues have helped me out with in the past regarding the kid. Josh and I have emailed back and forth quite a bit, and I've spoken with his buddy Ben Doss, another member of the coalition, who has also provided me with some excellent resources. These guys do have a YouTube channel called Chasing Billy that is a definite must-watch for anyone with a passion for Billy the Kid history. Link down below both to this channel and the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition website. Really worth checking out. You're not going to be disappointed. So a huge thank you is in order to Josh and Ben and everyone else over there at the coalition, not only for helping to preserve history, but also for being of such great assistance. Okay, now, if you don't mind, I'd like to discuss the affidavits. You know the ones. Back in 1950, William V. Morrison obtained 5 signed affidavits from people swearing that Brushy Bill and Billy the Kid were one and the same. I don't want to spend too much time on these. I go way more in depth in the last episode I did on Brushy. Link down below. I know we've got a lot of links. But as far as these affidavits are concerned, let me just go ahead and say that they are extremely misleading. This is where that misinformation aspect rears its ugly head yet again. When you say that 5 people signed affidavits affirming that Brushy Bill Roberts and Billy the Kid were the same person, it makes it sound like these 5 people were intimate friends of Billy the Kid, or at least just his peers. And guess what? Nothing could be further from the truth. Absolutely none of Billy the Kid's peers, his outlaw buddies, or the regulators, or people who lived at Fort Sumner, or even any of the lawmen that were hunting him down, none of them ever vouched for Brushy. Let me say that again for those of you in the back, because this is a huge point. None of Billy the Kid's friends or peers, or his outlaw buddies, or even the lawmen, ever stated that Brushy and the Kid were the same person. Zero, zilch, nada. Out of the 5 people that signed those affidavits back in 1950, 3 of them had never even met the real historical Billy the Kid. And this is by their own admission. I'm not just making this up. They didn't get to know Brushy until years after Billy's demise. Hell, one of them wasn't even alive yet in 1881. If they didn't know the historical Billy the Kid, then how could they have possibly vouched for Brushy Bill Roberts? The only affidavits worth examining, in my opinion, are the ones signed by Jose Montoya and Severo Gallegos. Both of these men did allegedly live in Lincoln when Billy escaped captivity back in 1880, and they did both vouch for Brushy Bill. Why, I do not know. Severo initially stated that Brushy was far too young to be the Kid, which was true, but he changed his tune shortly thereafter. Keep in mind that both of these men were children back in 1880. And I can tell you, with Severo Gallegos especially, his account is riddled with proven historical inaccuracies. Much like Brushy, he seems to have just been an old man who enjoyed telling stories. When it comes to him and Montoya, we are simply relying on their words without any actual evidence. And no, before you send me a strongly worded email about Jesse Evans, he didn't vouch for Brushy either. Somehow people have got it into their heads that former outlaw Jesse Evans was the one who tipped William Morrison off to Brushy living over in Texas. I'm not sure where they're getting this from, though. Truth is, nobody on Earth knows what happened to Jesse Evans once he escaped from prison in 1882. He simply disappeared to history. Per the book Alias Billy the Kid, the guy who supposedly told Morrison about Brushy's whereabouts was not Jesse Evans, but a Joe Hines out of Florida, who claimed that his real name was, wait for it, Jesse James. As my nearly 3-year-old daughter is fond of saying, this is so silly. Truth be told, there is no evidence that this Joe Hines from Florida even existed, much less that he was Jesse Evans. You see what I'm talking about when I say misinformation? These lies are constantly repeated as truth, oftentimes by people who just don't know any better. They simply heard it themselves from someone who they thought was a trusted source. And before long, the lies begin to accumulate, sort of like the photo comparison study that proved that Billy the Kid and Brushy Bill Roberts were a 93% match. Now, this study was conducted at the University of Texas by Professors Scott Acton and Alan Bovick. It allegedly utilized the same facial recognition software used by the FBI, compared the tintype of Billy to a photo of Roberts, and came back as a match. A very high match, like I said, 93%. But is that really what happened? Long time ago, I stumbled upon a discussion board devoted to all things Brushy Bill Roberts. BrushyBillProboards.com if you'd like to check it out. Anyway, a guy made a post on there back in 2017 saying that he contacted one of the professors I mentioned a moment ago, Alan Bovick. I'll go ahead now and read you the entire post in full. Just bear with me because this is important. I recently emailed Professor Alan Bovick, who was one of the 2 professionals who did the comparison study between the photo of Brushy and the Billy the Kid tintype. It's an eye-opener for me because this study was not reported properly in the media and in the books written about Brushy after. Here is my email to Professor Bovick and his response to me. Hi, Dr. Bovick. My name is Clyde, and I am a member of a Facebook group called Cold West Investigations. We discuss Old West history, mysteries, and events. As you can imagine, whenever the subject of Billy the Kid and whether or not he survived the shooting by Pat Garrett comes up, the discussion gets lively. I was wondering if it would be possible to get some information about the comparison study that you and Dr. Acton undertook back in 1990. If you could email me some information on the study, that would be great. If not, is there somewhere online where I can access this information? Is it your opinion, Dr. Bovick, that Brushy Bill Roberts and Billy the Kid are the same man? Thank you. Here is his reply to me. not at all conclusively the same. The face recognition tools were quite crude back then, and we came to no positive conclusion. However, the fellow that asked us then misstated our conclusions in support of the conclusion that he was indeed Billy the Kid. We reported him, and he was barred from using Billy the Kid materials by the folks he falsely reported the information to. Somehow it has appeared on the internet, the false conclusion. I have long forgotten about this and have no data, but perhaps Professor Atkin can help you out. Based on my eyeballs, I would say that Brushy Bill was just Brushy Bill. Okay, now there was a follow-up post by the same guy Clyde that reads as follows. So I emailed Dr. Bovic again for some clarification. Here is my second email to him. Thanks for the quick response, Professor Bovic. This is really interesting. So just for clarification, was there a 93% match of the Brushy photo as an old man to the Billy the Kid tintype? If so, is that a good match? Was the remark attributed to yourself and Professor Atkin that the resemblance between the two men is indeed accurate? Also, was the remark that the remaining 7% can be attributed to age and missing teeth accurate? Did either yourself or Professor Atkin say that history needs to be rewritten, or is this a false statement? Here is his response. I don't remember the 93%. Ask Scott. But the features used back then were archaic, and that figure would mean nothing today. I did not say any of those things, and I do not believe them either. All right, so there you go. Now, for all I know, this Clyde guy was just pulling this conversation straight out of his ass, so I, Josh, your humble host, decided to do a little due diligence and personally emailed Dr. Bovic. I will now read you my initial message, followed by his reply. And by the way, this conversation took place in March of 2024. Hello, Professor Bovic. My name is Josh, and I host a history podcast, The Wild West Extravaganza. I've done episodes on both Billy the Kid and Brushy Bill Roberts, and like many, have come to the conclusion that Brushy Bill was simply a creative imposter. It's my understanding that you've been contacted in the past due to the results of the 1990 study you conducted with Mr. Scott Acton. There's an online forum that quotes you stating that the comparison study was not conclusive and that there was not a 93% match between the tintype of Billy the Kid and a photo of Brushy Bill Roberts. At the same time, there are other results online that cite you stating that Brushy and the Kid were one and the same. Rather than rely on an internet forum, I thought I would ask you directly. I know it's been nearly 35 years, but do you recall this photo comparison study, and do you remember what the results were? In your opinion, is there a good chance that Brushy Bill Roberts and Billy the Kid were a close match, or were the results of this study taken out of context? Also, if you wouldn't mind, I'd love to have a recorded discussion with you on my podcast. I normally don't do interviews, but I think my audience would love to hear from an expert directly, especially in regard to these photo comparison studies and the technology used. Thank you for your time. And this is Professor Bovic's reply. Hi, Josh. Nice to hear from you, and hard to believe that this is still alive. Keep in mind that the face-matching tools used back then were extremely simple and rudimentary. Today, I am sure that there are face recognition algorithms based on deep learning AI that do a much better job. Unfortunately, I and Scott no longer work in that area. To summarize, we found nothing conclusive and felt that the claim was dubious. Unfortunately, there was another other. I think when he said other there, he meant author. We'll get to that in just a moment. Unfortunately, there was another other that intentionally misquoted us. So the best bet would be to get on Google Scholar and look for people doing face recognition work and ask them if they'd run the two photos. I'm going to decline the interview since what I would have to say would be extremely dated, not very supportive of the case, and I'd have to bash the misguided author. But Scott may feel different. Okay, and yeah, like I said, I don't really know what he means when he said there was another other that intentionally misquoted us, but I do think he meant another author. As to who this misguided author was that he mentions, I'll let you figure that one out. Now, Professor Bovic was kind enough to copy his colleague, Professor Atkin, and Professor Atkin had this to say. Dear Wild West Josh, I feel exactly the same as Professor Bovic, and although I have no scientific evidence, I believe that Brushy Bill Roberts and Billy the Kid were not the same person. So there you go. Don't take my word for it. If you want to speak with either one of these guys, Dr. Bovic or Dr. Atkin, they are pretty easy to find. Dr. Bovik's email popped up with just one Google search. And yes, it is an official email through a university, okay? So it's not just some random person I was talking to. I didn't email Dr. Bovik 42069 at AOL.com or anything like that. But yeah, I think you're probably starting to see a pattern, right? Every piece of so-called evidence in favor of Brushy Bill Roberts does not pass scrutiny. And to be honest, the mystery surrounding Billy the Kid's final moments doesn't really hold much water either. And I know I touched on this earlier, but that's not to say that there are no valid questions concerning the kid's death. There are. Did things really happen as outlined by Pat Garrett? Was Billy really armed with a pistol and a knife? How the hell do you button up your pants with a knife in one hand and a pistol in the other anyway? Did Pat Garrett open fire out of self-defense, or did he gun the kid down without warning? Did he really kill the kid in Pete Maxwell's bedroom, or was it Paulita's bedroom? At what time did the coroner's jury inspect the scene of the killing? Had the body been moved previous to their inspection? At what time was Billy taken from Pete Maxwell's room to that carpenter's shop? Where's the original copy of the coroner's jury report now? What happened to that? And of course, why is the final section of the coroner's jury report so weirdly worded in Garrett's favor? Lots of valid questions. Look, I am not married to Pat Garrett's narrative, and neither are most people who I know, historians included. If I had to place a bet, I'd wager that most likely things did not happen exactly like Pat claimed. But that does not mean that whatever happened didn't result in a dead Billy the Kid. A lot of Brushy Bill proponents will point out Pat Garrett's lack of credibility in order to validate Brushy's claims. However, what they don't tell you is that Brushy Bill has his own very real issues with credibility as well. Oh, yes, indeed. Brushy Bill Roberts was quite the storyteller. Just get yourself a copy of Alias Billy the Kid and you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. In addition to being one of the most famous outlaws of all time, Brushy also claimed to have been a Pinkerton detective, a deputy U.S. Marshal for Hanging Judge Parker, a member of the weirdly named Anti-Horse Thief Association, a teenage lookout for Belle Starr, a rodeo champion, and even a professional boxer. But wait, there's more. Brushy said that he served in Cuba as a Rough Rider under Teddy Roosevelt, fought in Mexico with Pancho Villa, routinely shot the branding iron out of the hands of stock thieves, caught wild horses down in South America and the Shetland Islands, operated his own traveling Wild West show, helped to put down the Crazy Snake Rebellion, survived a run-and-gun battle with thousands of Mexican soldados, toured with Buffalo Bill Cody as well as working on one of Bill's ranches, was shot over a dozen times, lived with the Yaqui, Arapaho, and the Cheyenne tribes, rode shotgun for a stage out of Deadwood, as well as working as a scout, and on and on and on and on and on. By the way, all of this is Brushy's story as told by him to William Morrison. I'm not putting words in the man's mouth. This is all stuff that he claimed to have done. And you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. There is zero evidence of any of this. And I do mean zero. None. No record of him being a deputy, no record of the Pinkertons, no record of him operating his own Wild West show or winning prizes at rodeos, and no record of him being a member of the Rough Riders in Cuba or any of the other fantastical claims. Imagine there was a new guy at your job, and so you strike up a conversation, just trying to get to know him, and he starts telling you this wild story about how he was recruited by the Navy SEALs when he was just 14 years old. He did a few years in the SEAL teams before he transitioned to being a Green Beret. And when that got a little too boring, he joined NASA as part of a secret program studying the effects of combat and zero gravity. He did that until he turned 21, and then he became the lead guitarist for the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Went on a few world tours with them, wrote all their greatest hits, but he always made sure he was back in Pittsburgh during the fall because, in addition to being a guitar player for the Red Hot Chili Peppers and a veteran of both the Navy SEALs and the Army Special Forces and NASA, he was also a star running back for the Pittsburgh Steelers, which is how he got his first Super Bowl ring back in 2005. Oh, and speaking of sports, his dad was a catcher for the Yankees, and he's related to Michael Jordan through marriage, which, long story short, is how he came to be a part owner of the Chicago Bulls. It's mostly a ceremonial title, though, as he's far too busy these days working on his PhD in molecular science to be managing a pro NBA team. Not that he doesn't like to have fun, though, okay? Don't get it twisted. When he's not working on that degree, he also enjoys long walks on the beach with his totally real and not made-up girlfriend, Beyonce. Oh, and by the way, He was late to work this morning because he had to stop and rescue a bunch of kittens and babies from a burning orphanage. Here's the catch, though. You'll never find any record of him doing any of this stuff because the CIA made sure to scrub his background. He operates in the shadows, and that's just how he likes it. You wouldn't believe this guy, right? You would rightfully deduce pretty quickly that he was totally full of shit. And Brushy Bill Roberts was no different. Truth is, we know exactly what Brushy did and where he lived for the entirety of his life. He was born in 1879 in Arkansas. He was a toddler in 1881 when Billy the Kid was killed, and spent most of his life working on farms, mostly in Texas. There are census records, marriage records, divorce records, land records, a family Bible, and even a damn draft registration from World War I that all prove exactly who Brushy Bill was. The only way this is explained by Brushy believers, the one thin little thread that holds this entire crazy story together, is the claim that Brushy, who said that his real name was William Henry Roberts, took the identity of his dead cousin Ollie Roberts, and that all those official records that I just mentioned reflect Ollie's life and not the life of the real Brushy Bill Roberts. Sure enough, if you read Alias Billy the Kid, Brushy did indeed recall discovering his younger cousin's dead body. Said that he came upon a bunch of lawmen up in Oklahoma who had just gunned down a pair of suspected horse thieves. Upon closer inspection, Brushy recognized one of the men as his cousin, Ollie, who incidentally had been working undercover for the Anti-Horse Thief Association. Brushy then took his cousin's belongings and returned them to the dead boy's family down in Sulphur Springs, Texas. Upon arrival, they mistook him, Brushy, for the dead cousin, and Brushy just sort of went along with it. And from then on, William Henry Roberts, aka Brushy Bill, lived under this assumed Ollie identity. Now, unfortunately, Brushy never gave a solid date as to when this occurred, but his proponents often cite 1910. Even they admit this is just a guess, but due to lack of any semblance of evidence, and just for the sake of argument, I'll go ahead and go along with 1910. Now, Brushy himself claimed to have been born on December 31st, 1859. So by 1910, he would have been a 50-year-old man, and his alleged cousin, Ollie, was born in 1879, which would have made him around 30 or 31. So in other words, we're to believe that Brushy Bill somehow convinced grieving parents that he, a battle-scarred 50-year-old man, was really their 30-year-old son. Also worth pointing out that Ollie Roberts' mother, Sarah, was only 56 in 1910. And she somehow believes that a man just 6 years her junior is her dead son. And by the way, no matter how you change the dates around, it still makes no damn sense. If this occurred in the year 1900, rather than 1910, then Ollie Roberts would have been all of 20 years old, and that would mean that Brushy Bill convinced a 46-year-old woman that he, a 40-year-old man, was her son. And if it happened in 1895, then Ollie would have only been like 15 years old when Brushy was 35. And we know it couldn't have happened any later than 1912 because that's the year when Brushy claimed to have married Molly Brown. More on that in a sec, but yeah, that's it. This dead cousin theory is the one little thin shred of nothingness that Brushy believers cling to in order to prove their case. And when you point out that Robert's entire life is well documented via the census and marriage records and all that, they just say that prior to circa 1910 or so, those records are reflecting Brushy's dead cousin, Ollie, and not Brushy himself. In order to cover his tracks, Brushy then invented fake parents, and his supporters have gone so far as to construct a fake family tree that they've attempted to connect to the actual real-life Roberts family. But as I'm sure you can guess, there is not a shred of evidence supporting any of this other than the words of Brushy Bill Roberts. No record of the Roberts family having a son who went missing, no record of Brushy Bill's fake parents, nothing. And not only that, but he contradicts himself multiple times. Give you a great example. In Alias Billy the Kid, Brushy admitted to marrying Molly Brown in Texas in 1912. He was telling the truth about that, as the records do show they were married in Texas on August 12, 1912. Presumably, this was after he took over his dead cousin's identity. However, when Brushy was recounting his various adventures with William Morrison, he said that he was operating a ranch down in Mexico in 1910, and when the revolution broke out, he remained in Mexico and served as a captain under Pancho Villa until 1914, at which point he returned to the United States. How he managed to be fighting in a revolution in Mexico and still had time to discover his dead cousin's body in Oklahoma, successfully assume his identity, and then fall in love and get married in Texas is beyond me. But I guess with guys like Brushy, the hustle never really stops. You know, it'd be one thing if at least a few of these claims were provable, but they're not. None of them. That's what's so damn frustrating about this whole thing. Like, why do so many people buy into this bullshit without one single verifiable piece of evidence? They're just going off of their feelings. And their feelings are in direct contradiction to all of the evidence and the historical documentation. But why would Brushy Bill lie? And what could he have possibly had to gain? He was an old man and he knew he was dying, and he just wanted to go out with a clear conscience, right? Well, first of all, he was not that old. Remember, he lied about his age too. Brushy was only 71 years old when he unexpectedly passed away. That said, as to why he lied, I haven't got a clue. Why does anybody lie? There is no fool like an old fool. And hell, to be honest with you, I hope I live long enough to become one myself. But once again, as to why Brushy would lie, God only knows. That said, I do think when people lie on such a grand scale, like Brushy Bill Roberts was doing, there's most likely some mental issues at play. I don't know how stable Brushy was there at the end, and I don't know if he was being taken advantage of, but something is clearly not right. So just in summary, there is no proof that Brushy had any scars, much less the same scars as Billy the Kid. There is no proof of Garrett killing the wrong man at Fort Sumner, nor of anyone who was there giving a deathbed confession. There's no proof that the mysterious Mexican Billy Barlow ever existed. There's no proof of Brushy having insider knowledge, and there's no proof of his fake family tree. And no, there is no facial recognition study that showed Brushy and Billy are one and the same. At the end of the day, Brushy believers are left only with uncorroborated anecdotal stories, a paper-thin dead cousin theory, and the word of two men, Severo Gallegos and Jose Montoya, who may or may not have known the historical Billy the Kid when they were children. Okay, so just to sort of drive all this home, I want to share a comment that I got recently from listener David. This is the type of stuff I receive on nearly a daily basis, either through comments or via email, but David really just hit all the high points as far as the misinformation goes. I don't know if he truly believes what he's saying or if he's just trolling or what, but I figured I could at least correct a few of his errors and hopefully dispel a few of these misconceptions. And by the way, David is not his real name, even though he did leave a public comment on a public forum using his full name. I decided against sharing it. I'm not trying to call David out or make him feel embarrassed or anything like that. So David, no hard feelings, but this stuff just gets spread around so much, and it is so wrong. Okay, so David writes the following. I will never believe that the man shot was Billy the Kid. Even if they prove that Jim Miller and Brushy Bill were lying, no one will ever convince me that Billy the Kid was killed. Pause. Well, David, we have already conclusively proven that Brushy Bill was lying. This has been proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. As for Jim Miller, I'll be honest, I really don't know anything about him. I'm aware there was someone named Jim Miller who also claimed to be Billy the Kid, but I don't know any of the details. Maybe I'll cover him one of these days as well, but as far as Brushy is concerned, yes, he was absolutely lying. Apparently, this doesn't matter to you because you're still convinced that something fishy occurred there at Fort Sumner. And hey, David, you are certainly not alone. Many people who do not adhere to Brushy Bill or Jim Miller also tend to think that maybe Billy the Kid was able to escape, or at very least, that no-good scoundrel Pat Garrett wasn't the one that killed him. So I just want to let you know that you are not alone. Okay, so continuing on with David. First of all, there was 4 Anglos speaking English. Does anyone think that Billy would go in there speaking Spanish to 4 Anglos? Pause. I really don't know what David's talking about here, but I believe he's referring to deputies John W. Poe and Kip McKinney. We know that they and Pat Garrett arrived at the Maxwell home late at night on July 14th. Pat stepped inside to question Pete Maxwell while Kip and Poe waited outside. The only first-hand account we have of what then occurred outside comes from Deputy Poe. You can read his account for yourself in his book, The Death of Billy the Kid. Just as soon as Garrett was inside, Poe claimed to have spotted a figure, partially dressed, approaching along the inside of a fence. The mystery man, who we now know was Billy the Kid, came almost face to face with Poe without seeing him. And when he did notice him, he jumped and aimed his pistol straight at the deputy, asking "Quién who is it?" He then backed up quickly, all the way into Pete Maxwell's room, while repeating the question a couple more times. Quién es? So I assume this is what David is talking about when he says that Billy was conversing in Spanish with 4 Anglos. Who the 4th white dude was, I have no idea. But I think the situation I just related, as described by Deputy Poe, is a little different than what David is imagining. You know, Billy just didn't stroll up and start a conversation in Spanish with 2 albinos. Hey, hola, fellow gringos, ¿cómo estás? El queso es muy mal. ¿Dónde el baño? Yo necesito el baño muy mal. It wasn't anything like that, right? It was dark. By all accounts, Billy was looking to fetch some meat for a late-night snack, and he didn't even see Poe until he was right up on him. Most of the people living there at Fort Sumner were Hispanic. Billy was fluent in Spanish, so it's only natural for him to have spoken a quick word of Espanol to a random person that had just given him a scare. As to whether or not Billy even noticed that Poe was white is completely unknown. Like I said a second ago, it was dark, and this entire encounter was over in mere seconds. I just want to make that clear because, as you'll soon learn, to David, this is a very big red flag. Okay, so continuing on with David's comment. Also, if it was Billy the Kid, he made one of the stupidest mistakes he has ever made. First of all, he knew Pat Garrett and a posse were in the area. The Hispanics who loved him, men and women, pleaded with him to go to Old Mexico. Billy the Kid had a 6N that saved him. He would not poke his head into a dark room and ask "Quién es?" Pause. First off, I agree. Billy did make a very stupid mistake. He returned to Fort Sumner after escaping jail in Lincoln. I cannot fathom why he would do such a thing, but he did. There is some speculation that he may have had a child there at Fort Sumner, or even that one of his girlfriends was pregnant, and he returned there to fetch him before striking out for Mexico. That may be true, I don't know. It is yet to be proven, but it could be the case. Be that as it may, whatever his reasoning, Billy waited far too long to leave. He should have never returned in the first place, but he did, and he got killed. As to your point about Billy having a 6N, I think what you mean there is that he had a sixth sense. In other words, his sixth sense would have told him not to poke his head into a dark room and ask "Quién es?" I don't really know how to address such a comment because now we're discussing something that can be neither proven or disproven. I mean, I personally do think that we as humans, at times, can tap into something almost supernatural that lets us know when things are amiss, but it's not exactly very scientific, right? And I certainly cannot prove it, much less prove that one person's sixth sense is better than another's. You know, maybe Pat Garrett had a sixth sense as well. Maybe his was just a little more powerful during the summer of 1881. I don't know. And by the way, Billy wasn't just sticking his head into a dark room. If Poe and Garrett are to be believed, and they are our only sources for this encounter, then Billy was taking refuge in the bedroom of a friend. A friend that, if he hadn't got killed, could have possibly been his future brother-in-law, Pete Maxwell. If the kid really did see something suspect, it's only natural that he would have slipped into Pete's room, which was just a few feet away, and inquire as to who in the hell these strangers were milling about outside. Okay, David continues. Now, the fact that he spoke Spanish to 4 Anglos proves to me that the man was a Mexican, and his deputies basically say as much. Pause. I still don't know who that 4th Anglo is. Maybe it was Jesus. I don't know. But no. The deputies do not basically say that the person who spoke to them was a Mexican. Matter of fact, Deputy Kip McKinney never did give an official printed account of what he witnessed at all, other than what he gave to that coroner's jury. As far as Poe goes, he did recount his experiences in his book, The Death of Billy the Kid, and he makes absolutely no mention of Pat Garrett killing a Mexican, or a Honduran, or a Salvadorian, or even a Guatemalan. I'll have to double check, but I'm also pretty sure there's no mention of Cubans or Peruvians. There is not a single mention anywhere of the dead person that was killed there at Fort Sumner being Hispanic. In fact, Poe is very clear that the dead man was Billy the Kid. Okay, continuing with David. There was only one man besides the deputies in the area. It was a Mexican man who was buttoning up his trousers. Back then, they did not have zippers. The deputies figured he hadn't believed himself. I think what David was trying to say is the deputies figured he had just relieved himself, and they said he was barefoot and carrying a butcher knife. Now, This is me, Josh, speaking again. My apologies, but this next part is in all caps, so I will read it as such. Just a footnote before I go on with the other evidence. Billy the Kid's name was not McCarty. Henry McCarthy, that was born in New York, was said to be burned over 60% of his body. That is not Billy the Kid. Okay, pause. Sorry, I couldn't resist being a little bit of a smartass just then. In all seriousness, though, let's go ahead and unpack what David just wrote. Once again, no, neither one of the deputies ever said anything about a Hispanic man buttoning up his trousers. Here's Deputy Poe in his own words, quote, I observed that he was only partially dressed and was both bareheaded and barefooted, or rather, had only socks on his feet, and it seemed to me that he was fastening his trousers, and he came toward me at a very brisk walk, end quote. This is the same shadowy figure, aka Billy the Kid, who then pulls out his gun and starts asking QNS. At no point does Poe say that this person was a Mexican, and neither did Kip McKinney or Pat Garrett. I would challenge David, or anybody else for that matter, to provide me with a credible source saying otherwise. Until then, I think you're just assuming that because this person said one phrase in Spanish, that automatically means that they're Hispanic. That next part that was in all caps where he's talking about someone in New York City who was burned on over 60% of his body, I'm still not clear really on what David is trying to say here, but I can tell you that this burn victim from New York, as far as I'm aware, this comes from just one source. Shortly following the kid's death, an article was printed and reprinted in various papers claiming that Billy the Kid's last name was McCarthy, not McCarty, McCarthy, and that when he was 10 years old, he was burned badly with some type of acid, and that about 4 years prior to his death, he had stabbed someone there in the 4th Ward of New York City, and that's what caused him to flee out west. I guess the people that were living in that particular neighborhood heard of Billy's death and were making the case that their burn victim and Billy the Kid were one and the same. I don't know much more about it than that, but they clearly have Billy mixed up with somebody else. If the kid really was from New York City, which, by the way, has yet to be proven, he probably was, but still hasn't been proven, he definitely wasn't living there when he was 10 years old. Billy first appears on the radar in Indiana with his mother and his brother in 1868. He was most likely just 8 or 9 years old in 1868. And from there, he and his brother and mother accompany future stepdaddy, William Antrim, down to Wichita, Kansas. They're living there in 1870, and then, following a brief trip to Colorado, they make their way to Santa Fe, New Mexico. It's there, on March 1st, 1873, when Billy's mother and William Antrim finally tied the knot. It's also where we first see Billy's name in print as an eyewitness to the marriage. And then, of course, they headed on down to Silver City following that. If Billy really did stab somebody in New York City, then it had to have occurred when he was like 5 or 6 years old. Because after that, we pretty much know where he was at. So in short, no, I do not believe that this particular news article offers anything much of a historical value other than being just an interesting read. Okay, I just thought I would point that out. David continues. Okay, now to keep going with the evidence, although his deputies basically said the man coming on the porch and wanting some meat was a Mexican, we know that because of the way he spoke. Billy the Kid can carry on a Spanish conversation with other Mexicans, but he is not going to speak Spanish with 4 Anglos. Directly after the fight, both deputies said, "You shot the wrong man, Pat, a Mexican." Pause. Once again, this is false. You can speculate as to why Billy the Kid would have spoke Spanish till the cows come home, but this idea that the deputies stated that Pat Garrett shot the wrong man is not true. We've already discussed this, but Poe did initially exclaim, "Pat, you shot the wrong man," and then just a few minutes later, upon examining the body, he stated, in no uncertain terms, that the dead man was Billy the Kid. As for Poe saying anything about the body belonging to a Mexican, once again, this is simply not true. There is zero evidence that Pat Garrett, Deputy Poe, or Deputy McKinney ever said anything about anybody being a Mexican. I cannot stress that enough. More from David. Pat Garrett was known and had a policy, thanks to Billy the Kid, of shoot first and ask questions later. The first 2 men he killed mistakenly believing they were Billy the Kid. It was okay because they also had capital offenses. Perhaps this Mexican likely didn't. Sorry, a lot of typos. I think he's saying perhaps this Mexican didn't, and That could put Pat's head in a noose, and even if he didn't, he would be ruined. Let's use Delvenia Maxwell's words right after he was shot. She said it was Billy the Kid, and the coroner's jury said it was Billy the Kid. She said, I knew it was not Billy the Kid. Pat Garrett knew it was not Billy the Kid. Pete Maxwell knew it was not Billy the Kid, and so did the coroner's jury. This is what she said in later years after her and the coroner's jury identified the man as Billy the Kid. She said, as far as me and the coroner's jury were concerned, we wanted him to be free and get away, and it worked anyway, didn't it? She was the first person to see the body because Pat Garrett and his deputies were busy running away from the scene. Pause. Okay, we've got a lot to unpack. Did Pat Garrett have a shoot-first policy? I know one of the big things that Brushy Bill proponents often point out is that Pat Garrett had previously killed 2 men erroneously thinking that they were Billy the Kid, Tom Folliard and Charlie Bowdry. But is that true? Well, we don't have a whole hell of a lot to go on, but according to Garrett at least, Tom Folliard was going for his gun. Garrett and the posse were laying in wait, and when Tom and Billy and everybody else rode up to Fort Sumner, Pat hollered out for him to halt, at which point Tom went for his gun, and Garrett, along with one of his men, opened up fire. There's nothing in the way of evidence, as far as I know, that points towards Garrett thinking that he was shooting Billy the Kid or mistaking Folliard for Billy. He was simply doing what any other member of law enforcement would do in a similar situation. He yelled halt, the man went for his gun, and Garrett shot him dead. As for Charlie Bowdry, yes, this does appear to be a case of mistaken identity. And yeah, it does look as if, by this point at least, Garrett had adopted somewhat of a shoot-first policy. He even stated as much, saying that the kid had sworn that he would never surrender and that he would die fighting, so he, Garrett, told the posse there at Stinking Springs that as soon as the kid made an appearance, he'd give the signal and for them just to open up fire. Sure enough, right about daylight, a man appeared at the entrance of that stone house, wearing a wide-brimmed sombrero of the type that Billy was known to sport. Pat gave the signal, and 7 rifles sounded. It wasn't until moments later that they realized they had shot Bowdry. So yeah, David is partially correct. Pat does seem to have made a decision to kill Billy on sight, or at least if he offered up any type of resistance, and Garrett did kill Bowdry, thinking that he was the kid. However, the greater point that David is trying to make is that since Pat Garrett had already killed 2 other men, one who he for sure mistook for the kid, it's not out of the realm of possibility that it could happen again, a third time, right? Hence this dead Mexican theory there at Fort Sumner. The idea is that Pat killed the wrong man for a third time, and fearing that he could land himself in hot water, he just went ahead and buried the body and said it was Billy the Kid. Then, of course, the residents there at Fort Sumner went along with it because they all loved Billy so much. Now, that said, there is no evidence that this is the case. Once again, nobody at all, neither Pat Garrett nor his deputies or anybody else who was at Fort Sumner, ever said anything about Garrett killing a Mexican or even killing the wrong man. And that includes Delvenia Maxwell and the coroner's jury. I do not know where David is getting his information, but no, none of them ever made any such claims. Once again, I would challenge anyone to please provide me with an actual source asserting that Delvenia Maxwell or Pete Maxwell or literally anybody who was there at Fort Sumner on the night of July 14th ever said anything about Garrett killing the wrong man. And notice also how David says that Delvenia was the first person on the scene as Pat and the deputies were running away. That's another tactic that Brushy proponents often use, the idea that Garrett ran away in terror because he was such a rank coward. Anything that could be used to besmirch his character only helps to lend credence to the possibility of him being a liar, right? The truth is they didn't flee anywhere. They made Pete Maxwell fetch a lantern so they could properly identify the body, and then they spent the rest of the night there in the house as a precaution, thinking that Billy's friends would try to avenge his death. I wouldn't exactly call that running away from the scene. Okay, continuing on with David's comment. Also, I don't care how far away a camera was. I don't care if it was all the way across the country. They would have stuck him on ice so they could photograph him with Pat Garrett standing over him. That would have put Pat Garrett in all likelihood in the governor's mansion. Both deputies to protect Pat, and as a request from Pat, had identified the man as Billy the Kid. In later years, they said it was absolutely not Billy the Kid. They said it was a Mexican with a beard. Billy the Kid, despite being a grown man, could not grow a beard. That's a known fact. Even his mustache was very, very soft and little more than peach fuzz. Delvenia said that the coroner's jury and all the other Hispanics wanted Billy the Kid to get away and get the law off his back, and it damn sure worked. Pete Maxwell only mentioned to one friend, and I know this is secondary information, but he told that one friend that Pat Garrett accidentally shot a Mexican and they passed him off as Billy the Kid. Pause. And thank you, David, for at least finally admitting that you're using quote-unquote secondary information. As to your statement about the camera, I do not know why on earth you think that Garrett would have ended up in the governor's mansion if he had his photo taken with a dead Billy the Kid. I'm just trying to think of any similar instance where a sheriff killed a known criminal and by doing so was elected as governor. Now, according to you, a photo would have proved that Garrett did kill Billy the Kid. Forgive me if I'm putting words into your mouth, but that's what I'm taking from your comment. The thing is, we already know that Pat proved he killed Billy, so far as the populace of New Mexico and the territorial government were concerned, because they did reward him very handsomely for said killing. As far as the law was concerned, Pat had provided sufficient proof. Look, bro, I wish they had taken a photo as well, but the fact of the matter is, the lack of a picture proves absolutely nothing. And no, in later years, nobody said that the dead man had a beard. At least nobody who was there at Fort Sumner. I already addressed this as well. The whole beard story comes from a dubiously sourced newspaper article printed just days after the kid's death, and we do not know where they got that information from. Not only did nobody at Fort Sumner ever mention Garrett killing a Hispanic man, they also never mentioned a beard. Nobody. Not one person, not two persons, nobody. Continuing onward with David's comment. Pat Garrett's daughter said that one day while drinking and being older, Pat Garrett admitted to her he shot the wrong man, and both deputies said on their deathbeds that the man shot was not Billy the Kid, even though they said he was, to save Pat Garrett's life. So that's at least 16 people that said Pat Garrett shot the wrong man, and about 150 Hispanics also said he shot the wrong man, which was why he left direct orders that the company was to remain chained around it and locked, and no one was to open it under any circumstances. She said the jury went along with Pat Garrett only because they wanted Billy to get away. The coroner's jury was made up of Mexicans, which is the largest population in that area. Pause. No, Pat Garrett's daughter never said any such thing. I think what David may be referring to is the claim that Pat's wife, Apollinaria, said that Garrett killed the wrong man. And the only source for this is a guy named Homer Overton. In the year of our Lord 2004, yes, 2004, Mr. Overton stated that when he was a young child, Garrett's widow told him that Pat killed the wrong man. This is a perfect example of the anecdotal evidence that I've been bitching and moaning about for this entire episode. Why would you possibly take the word of a random person living in 2004, who you don't even know if this guy even knew Pat's widow? Why would you take his word over the many, many eyewitness accounts of the people who were actually there in the flesh when the kid was killed? And besides, even if Pat's widow really did say that, which I don't believe she did, she wasn't there either. No, 150 Hispanics did not also state that Pat Garrett shot the wrong man. I got no idea where you're getting that number from, but I would challenge you to give me the name of just one Hispanic resident of Fort Sumner, or any other resident of any race or ethnicity, who made any such claims. Just give me one name. I'm going to go out on a limb here and assume that when you said company, you meant cemetery, as in the cemetery was locked and nobody was allowed in. But once again, I don't know where you're getting your information from. I can assure you there was ample opportunity for anyone to dig Billy up if they so wished. Matter of fact, it was so widely reported that grave robbers had been at his body that Garrett himself returned to Fort Sumner to make sure that the grave was unmolested. I don't know why you think that the cemetery was chained, but hell, I guess send me your sources, if you have any. I'm all ears and eyes. Continuing on, David writes, and I have to say this, Mr. Salazar's son, when he saw Brushy Bill, he said, if I see that man's eyes, I will be able to tell you in 1 second if it is Billy the Kid. He said most people have one color eyes or hazel eyes, but Billy the Kid had gray flakes in his blue eyes. They stood there and looked at each other for a minute, and all of a sudden Brushy Bill smiled, and once he smiled and he saw his eyes, Salazar hugged him tightly and would not let him go for several minutes. Billy also started talking to the man in Spanish and hugged him back extremely tightly and called him by his first name. Later on, they asked the man if he was Billy the Kid, and he said, "Did you not see me hug him very tightly? That is your answer." Pause. I don't know where David's getting this information from either. If the Mr. Salazar he's referring to is Genio Salazar, I'm not aware of Genio or one of his sons ever meeting with Brushy Bill Roberts. I do know that the gray flakes in the eye thing does come straight from Brushy Bill and William Morrison in the book Alias Billy the Kid, only to hear them tell it wasn't Salazar, but it was Severo Gallegos, one of the men who signed those affidavits claiming that Billy and Brushy were the same. If you'll recall, Severo initially stated that Brushy was too young to have been Billy, but later on he came around saying that he and Billy had the same colored specks in their eyes. Please feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but other than Severo Gallegos, I'm not aware of anyone else talking about these specks in Billy the Kid's eyes. And there is no historical description of Billy the Kid or his eyes that matches up to this statement. Once again, David is just taking the word of a noted fraud, Brushy Bill Roberts. Sorry, brother, but this is just not the smoking gun that you seem to think it is. Okay, continuing on. Billy the Kid got away. There is too much evidence suggesting he did, whether Brushy Bill was him or not. The only evidence that he was shot and killed was Pat Garrett and the deputies, and that's it. Everyone else in that town believed the man shot was not Billy the Kid. Pause. Nope, that's absolutely false. Again, every single iota of evidence supports the idea that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. There are numerous accounts of people who were there at Fort Sumner when Billy was killed who attest to Garrett being the killer. Not a single one of them, zero of them, ever said otherwise. So no, David, Garrett and his deputies are not the only source of evidence. We have numerous other people who also backed up their story. And no, they did not years later recant and claim that Garrett shot the wrong man. Details may have differed, stories may have changed over time, but the one constant, the one thing that never changed, the one thing that every single person there at Fort Sumner agreed on was that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. I know you've heard anecdotal stories that say otherwise. Maybe you saw a video on YouTube of some guy who said that his great-great-uncle used to put horseshoes on, Pat Garrett's cousin's pony. And Pat Garrett's cousin told him that his sister heard that Pat shot the wrong man. That's not evidence. We can't go on those type of stories. Those are just fun stories. They have no historical significance. Continuing on with David. And finally, I have to say this. If that man was Billy the Kid, he'd done one of the most brain-dead, stupidest things he had ever done in his life. I mean, Pat Garrett shot the wrong men. At the time, they believed one of the men's name was Charlie Bowdry, and it was the second man they believed his name was Tom O'Folliard. Both times, Pat Garrett identified them as Billy the Kid, and he made a mistake. We had to wait for Brushy Bill to come around almost 70 years later to correct the error and say that Tom was Tom O, as in the middle initial O, period, Folliard, and not O, apostrophe, Folliard. Later, census records believed he was absolutely correct and that the college graduate historians were all wrong. People can't believe that Billy the Kid made a crucial error, unlike the super stealthy way he had operated beforehand, and blundered into a darkened room where there were strangers around, but I certainly would never believe that. Billy the Kid is not going to speak to 4 white men in Spanish. It's just not going to happen. If this doesn't convince you all the evidence I love that Billy the Kid survived, then nothing will ever convince you. You were already too brainwashed. I mean, let's face it, that would be the 3rd time he killed Billy the Kid. Okay, and that concludes David's comment. Thank you, David. Now, just to address that last little bit, yeah, I once again agree that Billy made a poor decision in returning to Fort Sumner. Everything else seems pretty logical, though. He felt like he was safe, surrounded by people who he thought he could trust, and he was on his way to cut a piece of beef for supper. It was dark. He walked straight up to the deputies, Poe and McKinney, before he noticed them. Keep in mind that he had never seen either of them before and did not know that they were deputies. Nevertheless, Billy instinctively pulled his gun and quickly backed into Pete Maxwell's room, looking for a little bit of cover. Only thing was, he didn't know that Pat Garrett was also inside of Pete Maxwell's room. Seconds later, Garrett opened up fire and killed him. I don't know about you, but that does not seem to be all that crazy of a story. As for the idea that Billy in the past, that he was just this super stealthy, godlike operator, I've already touched on all that too. Truth is, Garrett was successful in catching him once before and placing him under arrest. Not to mention the time that Pat lured he and his gang into that ambush at Fort Sumner. So say what you will about either one of these men, but Pat absolutely 100% proved that he was capable of catching Billy the Kid. We know that because he did catch Billy the Kid, even before that fateful July night. And the Kid 100% proved that he was catchable. Now, the assertion that Brushy Bill was the first person to ever get Tom Folliard's name correct is just flat out wrong. Let me just say, though, that I am no expert on Tom Folliard or Tom O'Folliard. I, like many others, have always assumed, there's that word again, assumed, that his name was O'Folliard, like O'Reilly's. It wasn't until like a year or so ago that I found out that there's strong evidence that his name was Tom, middle initial O, Folliard. How true that is, I honestly don't know. Like I said, I'm no expert on Tom, but I can promise you that Brushy was not the first person to ever refer to him as Tom Folliard. If you want proof, just look no further than The Authentic Life of Billy the Kid, which was published in 1882 when Brushy Bill was barely off of his mama's teat. And sure enough, Pat Garrett makes numerous references to Tom Folliard. Not Tom O'Folliard, Tom Folliard. So no, this was not just some unknown thing until Brushy Bill came onto the scene decades later and corrected the historians. And even if Brushy did state that Tom's last name was Folliard, which I'm not sure that he did, but I'll take your word for it, then that means that he used just yet another piece of information, widely distributed information that had been in print for years, to pretend like he knew what he was talking about. And how about that little jab that David threw at those so-called college-educated historians, huh? David getting a little sassy. Hey, David, do you know why those college-educated historians think that Billy the Kid was killed by Pat Garrett in 1881? Because every single piece of first-hand eyewitness testimony states as much. All of the primary sources show that Pat Garrett killed Billy the Kid. There is a reason historians dismiss stories like the one that was told by that guy in 2004 making claims about Pat Garrett's widow. They dismiss such stories because they are unprovable, okay? They are not backed up by any other sources. They are just words. It'd be a different story if just one single resident of Fort Sumner agreed with any of your claims, but they didn't. And that's both before and after Pat Garrett's death. They all maintained that he killed the kid. I did address this on another episode, but anecdotal stories can be used in the study of history, especially when it comes to cultures where stories were only passed down via word of mouth, with no written language. But when you have clear, corroborated eyewitness accounts, dozens of them, versus the word of somebody who was not even there, or even someone who wasn't even alive when it happened, it's a no-brainer that you should place far more weight on the words of the eyewitnesses, especially when there's so many of them testifying to the same damn thing. Now, I don't know if David was doing this on purpose or not, but the way he just throws all of this information out at once without a single source is a very common tactic with conspiracy theorists. They just spout off a bunch of unprovable nonsense, and even though they can't back it up, this is how that misinformation begins to spread. It's just a non-stop, just word salad they're tossing out there, and people read it and sadly end up repeating it. And it just gets repeated over and over again, and pretty soon people start thinking it's true. Okay, one more thing. If you, David, or anybody else is looking for a good source, a historically accurate source, just go get yourself a copy of Billy the Kid, A Short and Violent Life by Robert Utley. The great thing about Mr. Utley is that he has an extensive list of sources. In the copy I own, it's over 80 pages of notes and sources, along with a damn bibliography. Okay, so you not only get to hear from one of the foremost Billy the Kid experts, but he also gives you the material that he used for research. You can then take these notes and these sources and read the original evidence for yourself if you need to. You may have to travel to a university or a library, but you can do it. You do not need to take Utley's word for it, or my word, or anyone else's word. Just read the historical documents, the letters, the eyewitness accounts, the news articles. They paint a very exciting, thrilling narrative. There's no need to add in all this conspiracy about a dead Mexican and some old man who was shot 24 times. Billy the Kid's life was plenty exciting as it was, okay? All right. Now, if you've heard all of this and you still think that Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid, I would kindly request that you listen to the episode I did titled, Was Brushy Bill Roberts Really Billy the Kid? I'd also ask that you listen to the episode I did titled, Was Billy the Kid's Death a Hoax? There are links to both of these down below in this episode's description. While you're pursuing those links, you might also want to check out a few of those articles from the Billy the Kid Historical Coalition. And if you do all of this and you still think that Brushy was Billy the Kid, then I do have one final request. Go fuck yourself. No, I'm joking. Ha! And I lied. I actually have two final requests. Number one, if you would like to discuss this more, please, before you leave a comment or send an email, I am begging you, at least come with some evidence. What is it that makes you still believe? What piece of evidence do you find the most compelling, and why? And also, please don't tell me to do my research, okay? I know what that means. When people on the internet tell you to do your research, what they really mean is that you should watch the same YouTube videos that they watch. You know, the ones that confirm their preconceived notions. I love YouTube. It's my bread and butter. But watching videos on YouTube is not research. And that includes my videos. Double check everything that I've said here today, or on any other episode. I keep telling you about all those links down below. Check them out. They are full of primary sources. But if it still sounds like I'm talking out of my ass and you'd like additional sources to back up anything that I've said, just reach out and I will try my best to get those to you. And if I got something wrong, let me know about that as well and I will issue a correction. I am very much open to corrections. And my second request for people on both sides of this debate is to just be nice, okay? Just be nice. I think we all started from a similar place, either as fans of Old West history in general, or just Billy the Kid buffs. That said, I've gotten a lot of hateful comments and emails over the years, some bordering on threatening, and they were all over Brushy damn Bill Roberts. If someone has differing beliefs than you, and it makes you fighting mad, especially over something as trivial as Billy the Kid or Brushy Bill, then there are some deeper issues that I think you might need to deal with. Might be time to log off the old internet for a while. Go spend some time in nature or read a book. Now, just to be clear, this episode was not meant to be some sort of a judgment or scathing accusation against those who have bought into the Brushy Bill story. This episode is simply just exposing Roberts for the fraud that he was. No more and no less. Okay? This is not some attack on Brushy Bill proponents. Not even Dan Edwards. A lot of people over the years have said that I should check out Dan's work. If you're not familiar, Dan is the author of Billy the Kid, an autobiography, and the host of the Alias Billy the Kid YouTube channel. He's also probably one of the most visible and well-spoken proponents of Brushy Bill and Billy the Kid being one and the same. This may surprise you, but Dan and I have spoken. He reached out, I don't know, maybe a year or two ago. We exchanged a few emails, and Dan was extremely polite and respectful. We may disagree on Brushy Bill, but I have got zero issues with the man, or anyone else for that matter. If you're looking to learn more about Dan's side of the story, what he considers the most plausible evidence in favor of Brushy Bill Roberts, then you should absolutely check out his channel, Alias Billy the Kid. Hell, while you're at it, pick up a copy of his book, Billy the Kid, an autobiography. I own a copy myself. So no, I have no ill will against Dan or anyone else who thinks that Brushy Bill Roberts was Billy the Kid. While I do find this entire debate frustrating at times, I'd be lying if I said that it wasn't one of my favorite topics. There just ain't no two ways about it. Brushy Bill is fun to talk about. Okay, so this has gone on way longer than I wanted it to, but before we wrap things up, I would like to address a couple more questions, mostly just for fun. These are questions that I normally wouldn't even entertain, but I've gotten them a lot over the past couple of months, so here goes. Question number 1 is whether or not Billy the Kid was dead when the famous tintype photo was taken. I have no idea where this rumor started, but periodically I will be flooded with questions or comments about this all at once. So I don't know if it's someone on TikTok or whatever the hell, and I don't really know what to tell you, other than we can be relatively sure that Billy was alive when the photo was taken because he literally handed out copies of the photo to his friends. There is nothing in the way of evidence, even so much as hinting that Billy was dead when the tintype was taken. The dead photo theory is silly at best and has no grounding whatsoever in the truth. More than anything else, I think the tintype itself is to blame, which we will discuss in just a moment, as it also ties into question number 2. Was Billy the Kid a woman? Once again, I have no idea how this started, but apparently there's a book that someone wrote, I don't know the name of the book off the top of my head, where they lay out the case that Billy had an innie instead of an outie. I have not read this book, I have no plans of reading this book, but a listener of the Wild West Extravaganza has, and according to them, the author asserts that Billy the Kid was, in fact, Susan McSween, wife of Billy the Kid ally Alexander McSween. Now, just a few seconds ago, I said that the tintype is to blame, and I think it's that same tintype that helped to at least partially fuel this silly idea that Billy the Kid was a female. It's not a good picture. I think we can all agree on that. And in addition to Billy being uglier than a shaved monkey, he does seem to have very wide, childbearing hips. And maybe, just maybe, this is where the crazy idea that he was a woman originates from. I don't know. And if that is the case, then I think that I can shed a little light on the issue. First of all, it's worth noting that the photographer took 4 images on a single metal plate, which afterwards was cut into 4 separate but identical images, each about the size of a credit card. Billy gave one of these to Delvinia Maxwell and another to his friend Sam Diedrich. The third somehow ended up in the possession of Boston's Illustrated Police News, who printed a woodcut engraving fashioned from the tintype while Billy the Kid was still alive, and the fourth was, at some point, in the hands of Pat Garrett. A likely theory is that he took it off of Billy after arresting him at Stinking Springs. The only one of these tintypes still known to exist is the Diedrich tintype, and it is absolutely covered in blemishes and smudges. There have been numerous failed attempts to touch the image up over the years, resulting in more than a few ridiculous renderings of Billy the Kid. This is where that giant chin and those wide hips come into play. And these touched-up images have been widely distributed and have greatly skewed our idea of the young outlaw's true appearance. Luckily, there is what's thought to be a carte de visite, or a copy on paper, made from one of these original images before it became tarnished. This copy was first used in Emerson Huff's Story of an Outlaw, which was published in 1907. And sure enough, without the smudges and the other blemishes that plague the Diedrich tintype, Billy's hips do indeed appear to be normal, and even his face doesn't seem as bulbous. If you would like to see this copy for yourself, you can find it over at the 100% free Wild West newsletter, in an older edition that I published back in September of 2023. Link down below with all the other links. So yeah, I don't know, man. I hope I helped to at least clear up a few misconceptions today. If you're a longtime listener to the Wild West Extravaganza, you're probably tired of hearing about Brushy Bill Roberts. My apologies. You'll be happy to know that I don't plan on speaking about Brushy again anytime soon, if ever. We'll see how long that lasts. If you're a new listener, I do have an entire series on both Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett, as well as a couple of other episodes on Brushy Bill, one of which focuses mostly on all the evidence surrounding Billy's death. Links to all these down below, as well as links to everything else that I've already mentioned. And if you're a fan of Old West history, make sure you follow wherever you're listening to stay abreast of new episodes. That's right, I said abreast. All right, till next time, remember, be nice and adios.